Hello there, my name is Max, and this is my writing advice and inspiration podcast, Omakase, or rather, a bonus episode of Omakase. Every month I propose a series of choices to my patrons, and they pick the one they like the most, and from that choice I make a long format workshop like the one you're about to listen. If you're interested in voting on the next one, getting to listen to it a month in advance, and supporting my channel, please consider going to patreon.com/mkaren. If you pledge $1 or more, you get to vote, you get to listen to it early, and you get a shout out at the end of every single one of my podcasts. Okay? Okay. And now, let us dive properly into the topic of the day. What lies ahead is going to be a long format, casual conversation about the 3 parts of a novel that I love the most. The original title for this conversation was going to be How to Make Me Love Your Novel, but during the act of working out my thoughts and what I really wanted to say, I ended up not so much summarizing my thoughts, but rather finding within them 3 elements that kept coming back to me, as though the 3 points in a triangle. I am gonna go through every single one of those 3 points, as well as the little sub points inside of them, kind of to round out my thoughts. The following is, of course, my advice, my opinion, what works for me, and my taste in stories, what I love the most, what gets me excited not only for reading novels, but for writing. Don't take the following as gospel, and don't take the following as hard rules, please, I beg you. The following is just what I love the most in stories, and the 3 parts, the 3 elements to a novel, a story that I love the most, that make me the most excited. There will be times throughout this presentation where I am going to make hard statements. Please remember that those are just my opinion. My opinion based on my experience, the books I've read, the stories I've written, and the people I've met. Especially the people I've met. I've been through a lot of college courses, I've met a lot of writers, I've done feedback for a lot of people, and I've written a lot of novels. I have seen many points of view, and I have learned from other people's mistakes. As always, life is too darn short for you to make all the mistakes yourself. So learn from others. Today, learn from the mistakes of others and the lessons that I'm putting forward today. The 3 parts of the triangle, the 3 points of the shape, the 3 things in a novel that I love the most. If I have to just give you a guideline for where we're gonna go, I will name them, and then I will double back around and explain them one by one. The 3 things I love the most in a novel are character, commitment, and sincerity. Let us begin with Chapter 1, Character. My favorite thing in stories, the topmost point of the triangle and the pyramid, is character. Character is at the center of my stories, and at the center of the stories I have grown to love and look forward to. Back when I was first getting started, I stumbled around through my stories, trying to find not only my voice, but my own approach to things. And I didn't find my footing until I met this amazing creative writing teacher in college. Her name is Marcy, and she taught me what I've now coined as the Golden Marcy Rule. Because I used to think that stories were about plot. I thought that plot was king, and that plot was a deciding factor of everything in the story. But this is not the case. The Golden Marcy Rule reads as such: character, as in character development and the main actors of the story, Character is not the byproduct of plot. Plot is the byproduct of characters taking action, making choices, and facing the consequences of both. My entire approach to storytelling changed when I met Marcy. I went from stories that felt as though a series of events happening to characters, as though they were reacting to events beyond their control, and became stories grounded in characters and what they sought to do, what they wanted to see in the world, their dreams, their passions, their goals. And I grew to love writing even more. One of my favorite parts about fiction is character. But not character as a collection of traits or a collection of abilities on a character sheet. Character as people. When trying to solidify advice about characters, you often stumble on terms like believable, relatable, understandable. But these here, I think, miss the mark. The real element that I love in fiction and I try to create myself when I'm writing is humanity. Characters who carry a sense that they are not just words on a page, that they are not just the product of someone's imagination, but that they are rather real people, as real as you and me, who made their choices because it was what they felt was right at the time, not because the outline told them so. Characters who feel natural in their actions and their choices, and who you feel for not because they have been the subject of misfortune and you wish them to not be in pain anymore, but rather because you relate to what they do, because you see in them the same human elements that you see in yourself and the people around you. The way in which I often try to work on this and achieve this, and I find effective in storytelling, is when a story allows a character to provide their own point of view. Even in stories that are third-person narration, you can still slip in the true character of the protagonist, showing us what they believe in, showing us glimpses into their personality and how they respond to the world around them. We will touch more on this when we talk about sincerity, but one of the elements that I love the most about character, especially when characters are written very well, is this natural sense to them, as though this character couldn't have been anyone else, because the person presented on the page is ultimately, absolutely who they really are. It feels less like you're reading a story that someone made, and more like you're reading the account of a real person. And this here, I don't think, is really hard to implement. I don't think so. I feel like the main element that allows this to work in fiction is to allow the character to talk, to explain their point of view, and to walk us through why it is they're making the choices they're making. I think one of the things that can most easily turn off the reader from what the character is doing is to feel as though the choice the character made was wrong. And I feel that moments like that, where you disagree with what a character is doing, not because your values differ from the character, but because considering who the character has been up until this point and what they have done, the action they just took doesn't make sense. It feels more like the character following the beats of the plot, as opposed to the character naturally making the choice. And that's a problem of perspective. That's a problem of characterization. Because if you show the character's point of view, and you show why they're making that choice, even if it is the objectively wrong choice, you will understand it. And I feel that we're coming again to a point that I revisit all the time. A good protagonist, a good character, doesn't have to be likable. You don't have to like what they do. You don't have to agree with everything they make. But I think the key is that if you analyze their choices and their behavior and what they have told the reader through the book, you look at their choices and go, I know why you chose to do this. I know it was the wrong choice, but I understand why you got here. and I understand why you did this. And I feel like we're once again coming back to the idea of humanity, because we're treating the characters like people. We're looking at their actions and we're respecting their choices. We need not agree with them. And trust me, there's lots of characters who I love, whose actions I did not agree with in the writing. But it was because their actions felt human, and their actions were understandable considering the world they were in, the situation they were in, and what we had known about them up until that point. Now, this idea that a character's point of view or POV is respected, and that they're treated like people, this is not just the treatment that I like to see in the protagonist. I like to see this treatment with every character. I've been doing this for a long time, and I can assure you that it's actually harder to only treat one character this way than it is to just give every single character the benefit of the doubt, and to write them as though they are real people. There's a lot of editing that goes into making the story flow well, and there's a lot of hard work that has to go into the manuscript to make sure that every one of those choices rings true, and that's fair. I want to just slide in right now, because it is entirely likely that there's someone out there who is listening to this video. I mean, this is going up publicly in November. If you're right now caught in the middle of writing your story, don't worry too much about this. Why? Why are you wondering? Because all those books that I've read and I had fallen in love with, and all those books that I read and I despised, those were finished books. You are right now working on the first draft. Worry not about character, or commitment, or sincerity for a little bit. And if you think that there is no story that can't be fixed during revision, you're wrong. I've been there. I have revised stories that required a lot of work, and it requires, one might say, commitment. But we will get to that point later. For now, take this as my general guideline for the things that I love to see in fiction, okay? I know I should have given you this disclaimer 15 minutes ago, but again, a casual conversation. The respect for a character's humanity is something that I want to see in every single character. Most importantly, the antagonist. I am tired of evil antagonists. I am tired of cackling mad geniuses and the leaders of secret organizations, all clad in black, whose backstory is shrouded in mystery, and whose motivations and purpose is never learned of and never understood. Antagonists who are so far on the other side of the moral spectrum that you can murder them with impunity and have your character not be treated as though their choices and their actions for resolving this problem was at all weird or strange. Wow, that came off way more crimson than I meant. But that's the problem, isn't it? And, from reading stories a lot and from doing this a lot, it's the thing where the only way to justify murdering someone to solve the problem is if that person is just so endlessly evil now, isn't it? And I'm tired of that. I'm tired of that because in my stories and in the stories that I've grown to love, the characters are real people. So you treat them like real people. And if they are real people, then their choices, even though they might be wrong, even though they might have choices or beliefs that have been based on prejudice, you can still display how they got there. And you can still show what their goals and dreams and passions are, even though they may be based on tarnished beliefs. Again, it is the respect of the character as a human being, as a person, to treat them more than a vehicle for plot and events to happen. Characters, real players, real members in the story, people who had backstories, people who made choices along the way, right choices and wrong choices. The idea of respecting the point of view goes both ways. And as someone who just finished editing a novel and I had to edit every line of dialogue spoken by the antagonist, I can tell you it's hard work. I realized that everything I originally wrote did not align with my overall message. And guess what? You can't see me because this is audio only, but I'm pantomiming scissors with my index and middle finger. That stuff gotta get cut out. It can't stay in the book. It's not aligning with the rest of my message and with the overall feeling of what it is to respect the character's point of view. Because when you do, and when you respect the point of view and you present their choices and you present how is it that they look at the world and how they arrived at where they are right now, you suddenly look at the antagonist and the protagonist and you realize they're both people. And there are parts in them that I see in myself. There are ways in which I too could become absorbed by jealousy and selfishness. But there's ways in which I too can overcome adversity, and I can be selfless, and I can show compassion, and I too can grow strong. Character is very important. It is the core of the story. It is the peak of the pyramid, the topmost point of the triangle. A story without character is nothing to me. And I know that I've said this before, and I know that it hurts some people, but I'll tell you the honest truth. You can spend years coming up with the most fantastic fantasy world, most amazing magic system, and if I don't care about the characters in that world, I don't care about that world ultimately. I read stories to find people, to see through their eyes a different world. Not so much because they are the tour guide, but because they themselves are part of the experience. Seeing the color through their eyes makes all the difference. I know I've gone long on this point, but there's just two more things that I want to say. Because it's not so much, it is not all about treating them like people. Those two are important points. The humanity, the respect of the POV, they're important points. Character growth, I feel, is a natural element of things happening. I feel that if you are respecting the character's choices, and they are making choices, taking action, and facing the consequences for what's happening, they will grow as a person. Even if they grow for the worse, they will change throughout that story. I have faith that if you follow what I've been talking about, and that if you look at your story, your character will change. I'm not worried about that. The one thing that pretty much leads into commitment and sincerity, and we will talk more about that there, but one of the things that I really dislike in fiction is when a character has a chance to grow, a character has a chance to encounter an obstacle that will test them as a person, as a human being, not only physically and mentally, but emotionally. And this obstacle is removed by some sort of sudden change. Sometimes this takes the form of Deus Ex Machina quite literally. More often than not, it takes form in the idea of characters stumbling into the right choice, or taking leaps of faith and somehow ending right where they're meant to be. That right there is one of those, and excuse the crimson words, it's a really weak kind of storytelling. Characters, and I've talked about this in the past, characters should never stumble into good luck. Characters should have to fight for everything they get, because the story is ultimately about them. And I feel, and I know, and I'm being really crimson, and I'm going long, I know, but it always breaks my heart when I'm reading a story about a person growing, and a person is struggling, and a person trying to become better, and suddenly they stumble upon the right choice. Suddenly they, excuse the expression, fall backwards on their butt and stumble on the real identity of the killer. And I'm just sitting there, book in hand, going, what was even the point? Why give me all of this deep character development and show me how hard they're working just for them to stumble on the answer? No free lunches. No easy ways out. We are here for the characters to emerge out of adversity. I'm not saying that we're here to watch them struggle and suffer, but we're here to watch them overcome adversity. Nothing should be easy. No free lunches, no easy rides, and even if they, by some stroke of luck, do get an easy way out of the trouble, there should be consequences. there should be things that fall through from that. There should be things they carry on forever. Because at the end of it all, what are we here for? To witness their point of view, to see them grow, to see and to experience their life through their eyes, to see those events through their own perspective, through the page and the words and the ink, to witness this visage of this world that is there and their perspective, and to learn through them, to experience through them. It always feels, one might say, a little insincere when a character stumbles backwards into the solution to the problem. It feels a little insincere. But we will talk about that in a little bit. In summary, my favorite part about writing, my favorite part about reading books, the topmost point of the triangle is character. Character and humanity respecting the point of view, showing us their struggle and them overcoming obstacles and ultimately growing, regardless of whether it is for the best and for the worst. There is no good. There is no evil. Stories are made of people. People can be wrong, but people can also be very, very right. Commitment. What do I mean by commitment? And how could that be one of my favorite parts of reading novels and writing them? I've always sought a commitment to the strangeness, a dedication to the stories that we find, the stories that capture us, and the stories we soon capture in pen and paper. Nothing makes me happier. Nothing fills me with joy while reading a novel and writing one than seeing and feeling the commitment to the strangeness of a story. I love it when I'm reading a story and I notice that the strange idea that was sold to me on the back of the novel is followed through into the writing, into the characters, into the story. And it's followed through into its ultimate extremes. I hate to have to start this point by making one of the most harsh calls that I can. But in my belief towards storytelling, in my take on telling stories and consuming them, I would very much rather that you give yourself fully to the story and explore it fully and dedicate yourself to the strangeness and the weirdness of the story that found you than to settle for tropes. I'm gonna make hard calls right now. The things we know, the things we're used to in culture, the predictable, the cliched, tropes, they are shortcuts and approximations. And sometimes in writing, writers use them to fill in for parts of the story. Sometimes writers settle for the easy ways out. They settle for the simplest explanations or sometimes no explanation at all. They have these clever, imaginative worlds that are ultimately an inch deep. They may be as wide as the surface of the world, but there is ultimately no depth there. No commitment to the strangeness. No commitment to this weird visage and this world that they found. I haven't even made the hard call yet. I'm trying not to make it because it is hard. But I think there's no worse failure than to just tell a mediocre story. I would very much rather that you give yourself so fully to the story that it's weird and bizarre and strange, and it throws people off, and many dislike it and hate it, but at least you did something more than just being mediocre. We do not know how successful our books are gonna be. We never know if we are just about to release something that changes part of the medium. You don't know if it's gonna be a ripple in a pond or a storm. But from my point of view, in my stories, and in the stories that have delighted me over the years, a commitment to the strangeness, in spite of not knowing what the success may be or where the story may go, commitment to the strangeness, giving it your all without even knowing, even if it's not successful. I would very much rather tell the story truthfully and commit to its strangeness than just to settle for the known, the mundane, the cliched, and the tropes. It is at this point in which I want to make a clarification. When I speak about the strangeness and the weirdness of stories, I talk primarily about a couple of ideas. But the one I'm centering myself on, and the one that I hope that you take from this, is that anything that you write is strange. Anything that you write is bizarre. Anything that you write is weird, because it is not our reality, and things are not unfolding as they do in our world. You're not writing facts about the way that life is here and now. And even if you were, they would ultimately be your point of view, your colors on the canvas. Throughout my years of writing, going to classes, meeting people in college, and being part of writing groups, I stumbled very often, and this is very close to the idea of sincerity, I stumbled very often upon writers who lacked a commitment to their story ideas. They would have this crazy, bizarre, amazing concepts, and they would walk them back. They would fill themselves with doubt, and they would second guess. What would people think of me? What would people think of the story? What if it's too weird? What if it's too strange and no one will read it? There are only certain statements that immediately ignite this flame inside of me. And that's when I feel as though I turn red with anger and fury, and I turn crimson. Because upon hearing that, what if the story is strange? What if no one likes it? What if no one cares? What if it's so weird that no one ever likes it? And upon hearing those words, and even now, I can feel my chest growing hot, and I can feel the fingertips of my hands growing warm, and I can feel my fists tightening, and I want to shout from the top of my lungs, what if no one remembers it? Because it's so mundane, and boring, and uninspired. What if you found the story, or the story found you? Through life, in the ether, in the nothingness, in that moment between sleep and wakefulness, you found the story. What if you never commit yourself fully to it? What if you finish the novel and you realize that what you've created is nothing but a shadow of the real story idea you got, the story idea you were too afraid to capture fully in pen and paper? Forgive me for being too crimson sometimes, but I could never forgive myself for doing that. Commit to the strangeness of your story. It is not strange enough. People will like it. If anything, because you will show them something they haven't seen before, something they can't predict, because it does not follow the formula. It does not have the familiar elements that we have known, the tropes and cliches that we are so used to we can call out from a mile away, because they're shortcuts, they're lazy writing, they are approximations, they are quick fixes, quick solutions. And if you have been enjoying media, if you clicked on this video, you write, you want to write, you have experienced stories, you know these tropes. They are inescapable. We see them everywhere. The instant you start analyzing fiction and truly looking at it, you will notice the shortcuts. Or some might say, the shortcomings. And I guess it's different for me, because I grew up in a different place. I grew up in a world of strangeness. I was not raised in the US. I was born and raised in Mexico. And the stories that I read, the stories that I grew up on, were those of magical realism. And not the magical realism that a bot can tell you on Twitter, but a magical realism that showed a commitment to the strangeness of a story. Frida Kahlo, Carlos Fuentes, Jorge Luis Borges, Gabriel García Márquez. And it is not always just the commitment to this magical world, to this world that is inherently, immediately different, and yet it feels familiar. Not only because it is accessed fully through the story, but also because of the craft that is involved in telling that story effectively. A part of committing to a story, moving away from just the idea and the concept, another element of commitment is being committed to making that story the best it can possibly be. And this is something that is hard, because I know that if you're listening to this, there's a chance you're going through NaNoWriMo right now. There's a chance that you're attempting National Novel Writing Month and you're procrastinating right now by listening to this video. There's a chance you're doing that. And there's a chance you're caught in the middle of the first draft of a new story. This might be the 10,000th story you have started. It might be the first one. And I know that right now, writing seems like the hardest part of the process. It feels as though you are climbing the insurmountable mountain, the undefeatable obstacle. That there's something that you cannot do, or that it will take so long to overcome. But you will overcome it, and you will do it, and you will climb that mountain again and again. Because when you arrive at the summit, you realize that it is only a part of a grander climb. I cannot express in words. Imagine that, a writer unable to speak or to express in words. The sadness that fills me when I've experienced friends, close ones, colleagues who wrote a fantastic story, committed themselves to the first draft, and gave up on the story. A story that was out of time, a story that escaped them, a story that left them. I've been there too. I'm trying to make amends for that right now. It's hard to commit to a story, because writing it is not only the first part, but it is, in some cases, the least intensive part. I'm not saying writing is easy. All I'm saying is that revision is a different kind of hard. And nothing brings me more joy than to read a story and see a commitment to the polish of it. To read a story and catch the foreshadowing. and catch the little twists to the characters' words, and to notice the color in the background, that it is not just there to fill in the words, it is not just there as color to fill in between the dialogue and the action and the next plot point in the outline. It is color that resonates throughout the story. The color red echoing across the story, from the character's childhood to the climax of the story and to the ending. The color, the elements in the background of the story that someone put there, that didn't happen naturally, and that during the revision process the writer noticed and brought into the foreground. A commitment to a story. Not just to write it, but to make it the best it can possibly be. To make the hard cuts. To make the tough choices. To spend the sleepless nights. To patch over the plot holes. To reinforce the choices. To rewrite the ending. To cut away that first chapter and a half and rewrite the prologue. To change every line of dialogue by one character. And to go back and make sure that that little change you made was not contradicted anywhere else. That's the hard work. That's the tough stuff right there. That's the hard work in fiction that people seldom talk about. Mostly because it's not very glamorous. And because when the writing is good, you don't notice it. When you're reading a book and it is very well written, you don't notice it. Everything flows so naturally, it makes you feel as though it had to be the way they wrote it. It's so effortless. It couldn't have possibly been edited. But it was. A lot. Probably spent more time in revision than in the first draft. But that's part of the process. That's part of the commitment. And when I read a story and I see the polish, it's breathtaking. As someone who does editing work, as someone who is paid to look for plot inconsistencies and flaws in narrative, it is delightful to read a story and realize that I have stopped looking for mistakes because everything flows perfectly. That's a delight right there. I'm smiling right now, because that's the goal. Okay. Before I finish this segment, there's one more thing that I want to talk about, and it relates to one point in character. No shortcuts in the story. No shortcuts. No shortcuts in the revision. No quick solutions. No quick fixes. I want to bring up this example right now before I just completely lose it and I forget about it. Before I completely lose it and I just go on a rampage. Because I love stories so much. There was a story that I read. The purpose of this scene was for the members of the party, the central cast, to discover the identity of the killer. The person behind it all. And there was, throughout the story, the elements had been set up. Almost as though putting the dominoes that you were later going to knock down. There was a visible thread in the narrative and the story. And I had caught it, and I had noticed it. And I could imagine what was going to happen next. Because since the elements were in place, and they had been established, it was time for the party to put the pieces together and realize and acknowledge who the killer was. Unfortunately, in this particular story, and I could feel it because when you've been doing this for so long, you can just feel when a writer gets really lazy. Because there's a thread. The foundation had been laid down. There is quite literally 2 dots and a line connecting them. One dot is where the party is right now. The other dot is the party discovers who the killer is. All you have to do is follow that thread. But I could tell that the writer realized that that was going to take about 20 pages of explaining and 20 pages of the characters working through the clues. So instead, you know what that writer chose to do? That writer chose to have the characters make a leap of faith. the writer chose to have one of the characters just guess the right answer. That is disheartening. Why even bother setting up the dominoes? Why even go through all this work? Why publish the novel if you're gonna publish the novel with this very clear, glaring error? A character? Then why even have them do all the investigation work if ultimately a character is gonna just throw a dart at a board full of pictures? That's dumb. That's beyond ineffective. It makes it feel as though if all you needed to solve the problem, to discover who the killer was to bet on the right number on the roulette table, then the problem could have been solved a long time before, and a lot of other things could have been avoided. It's bad. Why go to all this length? Why spend so much time working on this story? Why work so hard on this story to give up at this point? And I know what you're thinking, especially if you're in the middle of revising a story or you've been writing for a long time. I can totally understand where you would come from. And you would think to yourself, well, I just want the story to be done. And to that, I offer the following advice. Take a day off. Step away from the story. Because I would very much rather, I think you would be making an unwise choice to go for that shortcut than just taking a couple days off, stepping away from the story, and coming back with a fresh set of eyes. Or at least slightly less sleep-deprived eyes. You have come all this far. Just imagine the young writers listening to this right now, who are going through their first novel right now. You're gonna tell them that you fought through the writing process, you fought through the revision process just to give up at this point? Don't be that sort of person. Give it time. That book is only gonna come out once, and I would rather that it come out in the best form that it can. Last but by no means least, one of the last things, and it's really connected to the next point as well, so I'll just walk through it really quickly. Everybody worries a lot about the conclusion of a story, the ending. And that is mostly because a lot of stories are plot heavy. They are very much focused on events happening leading towards something. That's why it leads to a culture of people caring so much about an ending and not so much about the experience that they have actually had throughout the novel. When you have a story that is focused on character and their development, the ending is less of a big deal because you're not working towards an answer, for an example, who was the killer, but rather witnessing the experience of the characters. But even so, what makes a good ending? What makes a good conclusion? And I think that part of it, ultimately, is to have a resolution. To have the events of the story arrive at a checkpoint. We've all been here. We can all relate to this. There's a certain icky, gross feeling that comes with finishing a story and realizing that the very last chapter ends with a cliffhanger for the next story. As though the conclusion that should be taking place here is not as important as trying to get you for one more novel. And that feels insincere. And that feels ineffective. Don't do stuff like that. It's okay to let the ending sit. It's okay to slow down for a moment, bring the camera close, and show us something. And if you do not wish to give me the answers as to what happened, then at least leave me with something to think about. Okay? And I'm being very broad on this particularly last bit. But I do feel that if you're committing to the story, and if you're writing about a character, the ending and the resolution will come to you naturally. Okay? And now, let's talk about the very last point. Sincerity. This one, I feel, is the easiest and the hardest to explain. I've met a lot of writers, and every once in a while you stumble upon someone who's writing for different reasons. I don't really want to say wrong reasons, because to each their own, but I would use the term misguided. I met a lot of people, especially in college, who were writing not because they enjoyed storytelling, and not because they had a story to tell, but rather because they wanted to get something out of the writing. They wanted to impress someone, they wanted to get back at someone, they wanted to be, and I am quoting, respected. And this led to their writing feeling insincere. Their writing felt pretentious. They would overstuff their writing with big words to appear as though they knew more than the people around them. They would force their story to be what they wanted it to be. And always, when faced with criticism about the ineffective parts of their writing, or ultimately the flaws in their narration and their prose, the reply would always be an attack at the person giving criticism. There was always a sense that they were taking the criticism as a personal attack, because ultimately the writing that they were putting on the page was not so much the parts of a story, but the building blocks of their statements, of their desire, of what they wanted to do. And this made their writing feel insincere. It felt as though what I was reading wasn't actually what the story was about. I've always used this descriptor, and honestly, I feel that it works. With people like this, people who would use writing for something else, whether it was to get back at that ex, or to finally get the respect of so-and-so, or just to get a kick out of feeling superior, it felt as though there was an inch of glass between the story and what they presented. It felt as though sometimes the story was just a vehicle for what they wanted to do or say. Familiar faces would prop up as antagonists in stories. Certain figures would clearly just be analogs, not just for members of the class, but also for figures in pop culture, and sometimes even family members in a very specific case. It felt insincere. And it was strange for me, because, I'm in a class of people. I am in a class of writers who want to improve their craft, and it really felt as though they were at the wrong place. But this is not only a thing that, I've noticed in classes, but also in writing in general. Every once in a while, I stumble on a story that has an interesting setup, has characters at the center of it, is well edited, but then once you squint your eyes a little, you notice an insincerity to the writing, a certain twist to the words. It is usually pretentiousness. There's a lot of stories I've been catching recently where I sense this pretentiousness, this mightier than thou, this I want to really talk about this other thing, but let's talk about this story for now. It felt as though, and I've always been very, very crimson about this, you should just write about what you want to write. And if you have an issue with so-and-so in the class, or if you have an issue with so-and-so, or if there's a problem that you need to sort out with your family, you should just go and do that and not waste the time of everyone in the class. Write about what you really want to do. Write about what excites you. Give yourself fully to the story. And I guess it's strange for me, because I've been doing this for a while and I have my own particular way of doing things. But those of you who've been following me forever now, because you've seen my guide to how to plan a novel, the first question is, what excites you? What do you want to write about? I have never written a story as the vehicle for something else. It's weird. I can't even wrap my head around it. I can't even wrap my head around, going through that. And I do understand someone out there might be saying that people write to overcome certain feelings, or people write to get feelings out of their chest, and that's completely fine. The difference here is that these stories were never presented as such. They were always presented as creative work, which made me wonder if there was someone trying to kill two birds with one stone. And I think I've mentioned this in a previous Omakase, but it's the idea of like, if you're showing up to a creative writing class and you're turning in creative writing, it's gonna get, critiqued like creative writing. And I had a fantastic teacher who always, recommended us to use communication. So it's a sort of thing where had someone been like, hey, I just want light feedback. This story is more for me than anyone else, I would have given them light feedback. And I would have focused on the positives, which is what I tended to do when I wanted to inspire someone, instead of just, being truly, or giving them a full-on critique. Because sometimes people just want to be inspired, and that's completely fair. There's nothing wrong with that. I have needed that sometimes too. But these people never did that. It was never a matter of, please give me a light critique. And when the criticism came, their reply was always a personal attack. And that's strange. I would like you to not be that way. I would like to inspire you to be sincere in your writing. And sometimes, I know, sometimes it feels like the world sucks. And sometimes you have to get it out on the page. And sometimes it sneaks into our stories without realizing it. And that's fine. That happens. I know that. I've been there. But it is the job of you, as the writer, to look at it and ask yourself, does this belong here? This rant that the character makes, this character who suddenly appears in one scene and never comes back ever again, are they really important to the story? Do I care enough about them that I'm willing to keep them in the story? Do I care about them more than I care about the story? The answer is no. The answer is always no. The story comes first, because we're committed to the story. And in order to be sincere, we have to revise our words to make sure that there isn't an inch of glass between where the story has to be to what we really want to say and what we're saying. It is that distance. It is that distance that sometimes kills books for me. When I'm reading something and I feel this distance between where the story is going, or where the story implies that it is going, and what the story is saying. And I know what you're thinking. Max, is there a chance that sometimes that's on purpose? I don't think so. I think it's too much work to purposefully make your story read bad. I've always believed in Occam's razor. I think it is much more believable that someone is being lazy, or someone is not fully committed to their story, or to making it really polished, rather that they would purposefully write the story to sound and flow bad. And now, because sincerity is really straightforward, sincerity almost rolls into one with commitment, and with character serving as the crown jewel. Because, like I mentioned before, when all these things are working in tandem, you don't notice it. The story flows so well, and it reads so smoothly, that you don't notice. There is no barrier between you and the story. It feels as though it's right there, as though there is no film, no page keeping you away from the story. There is no inch of glass. There is no gap, no abyss between the story and you and the words and the images. we become lost, enthralled with what we see. A vision of the story that only we could see, because we're taking the inspiration, we're taking the words, we're taking the visage crafted by the writer, and we're recreating it in our minds. It is in that flow, that strange dance of imagination and reading, acknowledging and imagining, seeing and understanding, all happening at the same time without us realizing it. Painting landscapes and images, houses and rooms and characters. Seeing eyes of a different color, because the blue that I painted with is not the blue that you paint with. And when everything is working just right, and when all the pieces fall together at the right spot, you don't notice it. You can't notice it. Everything is working as intended. The characters feel real, even more real than anyone you have ever met. And even if you don't agree with them, you relate to them, and you see in them the human parts that make you human, and you realize just how you too as well could become absorbed with rage, jealousy, greed. You can see how you could fall from grace, and you could make the wrong choice without realizing it. But you also realize how you can be compassionate and selfless. And even though the world may seem broken and ruined, you too can be a beacon of hope against the dark shore. There is no greater delight than to read through a story and become lost in it. It is my job to find what is wrong in your story. It is my job to look for the inconsistencies, to search the canvas of the story for mistakes. It is my duty. It is what I do. And there is no greater delight to be able to get lost in a story and not question it, because there's nothing to question. And to not question the characters, because they are people. And to feel just exactly what you meant to say, because there is no ulterior motive in the words. And the words that I read are the characters' thoughts, their truest thoughts. They are real thoughts. And I am left at the end of the story satisfied and happy and a little sad, because this real world that you painted for me has ended, and I already miss it. And so, welcome to a bonus episode of Omakase, my writing advice and inspiration podcast. I hope that today's, or this month's, strange workshop was something you enjoyed. These three elements are something that I carry through in all parts of my fiction, and it sometimes even shows up in this podcast. I always try to be honest and to tell you what I really feel, but not sell it as facts, not sell it as hard rules. I always try to show you where my feelings came from and what caused me to be, or what allowed me to be here where I am right now. Stories are wonderful. And this is why I love this job and this medium. It is these stories, these tales that are unlikely and yet so real to us. No matter how strange no matter how weird or bizarre, when we get lost in the narration and the dialogue and the description, they feel more real than this world. I have been to countless worlds through the stories and books that I've read, and I do miss them. And I have images of places I've never been to, and yet they feel more real than some of my memories. That's the magic of writing. That's why I wish to inspire you to dedicate yourself fully to your story. Not because it will make it successful, but because it will be the truest form of that story that you could have made. And you can put down the book and think to yourself, I did these characters justice. Okay? Okay. If you enjoyed listening to this podcast/video, please consider leaving a rating or leaving a like, whether you're watching on YouTube or listening to this in your favorite podcast apps. Your support really does mean a lot. And I said at the beginning, please consider going to patreon.com/amkieran. For $1, you can vote on next month's haul, as well as get to listen to the next workshop a month in advance. And now, as a little extra reward to all of the lovely people pledging their support through Patreon, I will now shout their names. You need not stay through this segment unless you want to listen to me butcher the names of my lovely supporters. If you do decide to leave, all I want to say is thank you for listening. Thank you for tagging along until this portion of the video, and I hope that you have a lovely day. Okay? Okay. And now, I would like to give a big thank you to the following people. A. Howard, Atlak, Alistair Baywood, Elisa Dudley, Amanda Stevens, Amelia, Amy Palmer, Angela, Aniexo Hoshi, Biting the Sun, Blarg, Brenda, C.E. Richards, Caitlin, and the other Caitlin, Carriette Eccleston, Kathy Lindsay, Lishadra, Christiane, Christine Dennis, Kristen Lofton, Clem Pastor, Dwayne Jackson, Eleanor, Erasos, Joffrey Raby, Gilbert Gaudreau, Hero Song, Irina Phoenix, Janosch Heibotsky, Jaytona Kirkwood, Jeffrey James Williams, Juan Nunes, K.M. Anderson, Kamishore Rao Shaluri, Kaylee, Kiel, Kit Lee, Lacey, Lier Killo, M.T. Locatelli, Mark Maruska, Mary Foster Smith, Nicola, Nicole Grissom, Nicolay, Noam Sohar, Nobles and Tomes, Pablo, Pat Eitson, Polly Craftwell, Raquel Fernandez, Roa, Shimmertails, Sky D. White, Soulmuse, Sylvia Leitilla, Synexia, and Wendy Christopher. Hey guys, welcome once again to the end of the video club, where we stay until the end of the video. What did y'all think about this one? I feel like I ended up way more serious than I would have liked, but at the same time, I feel like there was no other way to tackle this, because although the original title for this was going to be really casual, you know, How to Make Me Love Your Novel, I didn't want to end up just giving you a list of like 10 items that I love in fiction. I ended up realizing that I wanted to give you ideals as opposed to just elements. I wanted to give you more than just scenes that I like, or character development, ultimately tropes that I like. I wanted to give you values, tools for your writer's toolbox. And I spent a long time, like refining and redefining what I wanted to say. And I ended up coming back to character, commitment, and sincerity. And this is coming to me, after having done so much editing recently, and also after reading a lot of really bad books. Man, I read so many bad books in the last, 3 weeks or so. And, I stopped talking about them because it started being a little bit exhausting. I originally wanted to have a new segment on the channel where I would just, talk about these bad books, but I realized that it would end up feeling like punching down, which is not part of how I do things. So I ended up just, scrapping it. I finished those books against my better judgment and the better judgment of my lovely spouse. But, I'm looking forward to reading more stuff that I know is not gonna fail me. But I'm also looking forward to reading what you make. I know that writing a book takes a long time, and I know that it can be incredibly daunting, especially if you're caught in the middle of NaNoWriMo. But it takes time. And you're not racing anybody. I would very much rather that you make that book the best it can be than to rush it out. Your book is only gonna release once. So work hard. Give it your all. Commit to it. Commit to your characters. And show me just how great of a story you can tell.